In the firelight of his forge, with bronze tools arranged around him and the glow of the furnace warm against his back, Hephaestus speaks to his mother. His voice is not raised. It carries no particular urgency. It has the quality of a man describing something that happened long ago and has been turned over many times since, the way old things are described when their edges have been worn smooth by the handling. This is Book 18 of the Iliad, and the moment Homer gives us is a quiet one inside a loud story. The Trojan War is pressing in from all directions. Thetis, the sea nymph, has come to the forge to ask a favor, and Hephaestus, before he agrees to anything, pauses and speaks of Hera. He speaks of what she did for him and what she is to him, his voice moving through the heat of the room with the ease of long familiarity. The bond between them is not the formal bond of myth and genealogy. It sounds warmer and more ordinary than that. It sounds like the thing a person carries when they have been helped by someone whose help mattered and have not forgotten. What Homer is showing us here, without stating it directly, is that in his telling of this tradition, Hephaestus has one parent, not two. Hera alone brought him into being through a process that ancient commentators called parthenogenesis, divine generation without a male contributor, the goddess making life from herself in the way that certain Greek sources also attributed to the creation of other figures at the margins of the divine family. There is no Zeus in this account of Hephaestus's origin. There is only a mother and the son she bore, and between them a warmth that Homer renders with the economy of a writer who knows the emotional weight of a scene does not require decoration. This is where the tradition begins, not with a genealogy and not with a problem, but with a specific voice in a specific room, and the particular texture of a bond between two figures whose relationship meant something. The forge is warm, the sea nymph is waiting, and somewhere inside the fire and the bronze and the carefully spoken words, there is a god who has one story of where he came from, and somewhere else in the ancient world, on another hillside, around another fire, being told by another voice entirely, there is a second story, and it is different. The second story comes from Hesiod. His Theogony, composed in the late 8th or the early 7th century BCE, is one of the foundational texts of what we can recognize as systematic Greek cosmological thinking, a poem whose project is to lay out the divine family of the Greeks in full, to name the gods and place them in their proper relations to one another, to describe how the world came to be and who governs it, and from whom each governor descends. Hesiod is not a storyteller in the way Homer is a storyteller. He is something more like a careful archivist of divine genealogy, and his great poem has the texture of a document that is trying to get things right. In the Theogony, Hephaestus appears among the children born to both Zeus and Hera. He has a father. He stands in the patrilineal line that the poem is at pains to establish, part of the ordered succession of divine power that Hesiod traces from the first movements of chaos through to the settled reign of Zeus on Olympus. His position in this account is clear and unambiguous. He belongs to the family in the standard way. He is the son of the king of the gods and the queen of the gods, which is exactly the kind of origin a god of his standing might be expected to have. These two accounts cannot both be entirely right, in the way that a set of directions giving two different starting points cannot both be entirely right if you need to know where the road actually begins. But the Greeks who held both accounts were not, on the whole, troubled by this in the way that troubles us. The tradition was not a single text administered by a single authority. It was a living thing, moving through hundreds of communities over centuries, told at festivals, and inscribed in poems, and passed between the hands of different writers, who each brought their own traditions' received knowledge to bear on the material. That two major poets of the archaic period should have told the story differently was not a scandal, it was simply the way things were. Ancient commentators noticed the discrepancy. The scholiasts, those patient and meticulous scholars who annotated the Homeric epics with marginal notes that have survived alongside the texts in many manuscripts, explicitly acknowledged the difference between the Homeric and Hesiodic versions of Hephaestus's parentage. They named it. They described what each source said. They were not distressed. The tone of their engagement with the problem is almost uniformly one of careful intellectual attention, the attention of people who are used to holding multiple versions of a thing, and who regard the existence of multiple versions as a feature of the tradition rather than a fault in it. This is a posture toward contradictory evidence that is in many ways more sophisticated than the drive to resolve it. To hold two accounts side by side and say, here is what Homer says, and here is what Hesiod says, and both of these were believed somewhere, and both of these are worth keeping. That is a form of attention that takes the tradition seriously in its full complexity, rather than simplifying it down to a single defensible statement. The scholiasts who noted the discrepancy were not failing to solve a problem. They were accurately describing the situation. Hephaestus himself, within the divine order as most people understood it, was one of the 12 Olympians. This designation, the 12, refers to the canonical council of major Greek deities understood to reside on Mount Olympus, the highest peak in the Greek world, conceived in the tradition as the home of the gods and the center of divine governance. The 12 were the primary powers of the cosmos, the figures whose names were invoked at the great civic festivals, whose temples stood in the centers of Greek cities, whose stories organized the way the Greeks understood the relationship between the divine and the human. To be one of the 12 was to occupy a specific and significant place in the cosmological structure the tradition maintained. The composition of the 12 was not, however, entirely fixed. Ancient sources vary in their lists. Hestia, the goddess of the hearth, appears in some enumerations and not others, sometimes replaced by Dionysus in later accounts. The divine family was large, and the canonical inner circle was a product of religious convention and civic practice rather than a rigid theological decree. Different cities emphasized different gods. Different regions maintained different traditions, but across the variation, Hephaestus appears with consistency. He is listed, named, placed. Whatever the uncertainty about who fathered him, his position among the Olympians was not in dispute. There is something worth pausing on here. A god whose origin story contains an unresolved contradiction, who may or may not have had Zeus for a father, who was born either in the standard way or through a process of divine self-generation, nonetheless occupies one of the 12 seats at the highest table of the divine order. The ambiguity of his beginning does not destabilize his place in the structure. He sits with the others. He is named among them. His forge fires on Olympus. His presence in the council is absorbed into the symmetry of the whole, without apology, as if the question of where exactly he came from is a detail that the structure is comfortable leaving open. This is perhaps how the Greeks managed many things, not by resolving every tension the tradition generated, but by finding the structures that could hold the tension without being undone by it. The 12 Olympians as a concept had room for Hephaestus. The tradition had room for Homer and Hesiod, both. The ancient world was larger and more patient with irresolvable questions than the impulse toward tidiness might wish. The Hellenistic period brought a different kind of attention to these questions. When Alexander's conquests opened the eastern Mediterranean and eventually produced the great institutional center of learning at Alexandria in Egypt, scholars of Greek literature and mythology found themselves for the first time with access to the full range of Greek textual tradition in something approaching its entirety, or at least more of it than had been available to any single scholar before. The Library of Alexandria, that vast and ambitious project of collection and annotation, became the place where these contradictions could be examined systematically rather than absorbed locally. Figures working in the tradition of Pherecydes of Athens, the 5th century mythographer who had made early attempts to rationalize and reconcile the conflicting genealogical accounts in Greek tradition, and later the compiler known as Apollodorus, whose Bibliotheca attempts something like a comprehensive handbook of Greek mythology, engaged directly with the problem of Hephaestus's birth. They knew both versions. They described both. They attempted with varying degrees of success and varying methodological approaches to find a way of reading the tradition that could make the two accounts cohere. What they found was that the accounts resisted coherence in any entirely satisfying form. The Homeric version implies a sequence. Hera produces Hephaestus alone. The bond between them is primary and unmediated, and his identity as her son in the most complete sense, son without a father, born of her will and her power alone, is the emotional foundation of his relationship to the divine family. The Hesiodic version implies a different sequence. Zeus and Hera produce Hephaestus together in the standard way, and his position in the divine order is grounded in the standard patrilineal genealogy the theogony traces. To adopt one is to abandon something irretrievable in the other. The Alexandrian scholars, working in the lamplit spaces of the greatest library the ancient world assembled, held both accounts and found they could not choose. What they left behind, then, was not a resolution. What they left behind was a description of the problem and a set of readings, ways of understanding how the tradition could contain the contradiction without being destroyed by it. That is, in its own way, an answer, not the answer that says one version is right and the other wrong, but the answer that says the tradition is larger than any single account of it, and that the God who appears in both is recognizably the same God, even when his origins are told differently. Hephaestus at his forge, speaking to Hera in the warmth of Book 18, is the same God whose name Hesiod places in the ordered genealogy of the theogony. The fire is the same fire, the bronze is the same bronze, the God is the same God. The image Hesiod gives us of Olympus as a whole is worth dwelling in for a moment, because it clarifies what it means for Hephaestus to occupy a position there. Hesiod's Olympus is a place of divine order. His theogony builds toward it across hundreds of lines, describing the primordial forces, the Titans, the war between the Titans and the Olympians, the eventual victory of Zeus, and the establishment of divine kingship, so that by the time the reader arrives at Olympus itself, it has the feeling of a destination earned. The gods who sit there have their places. Their genealogies are laid out. Their domains are allocated. The family tree of the cosmos has been set down with the precision of a careful scribe who intends that future readers will know, without ambiguity, who governs what and how each governor came to be. In this ordered structure, Hephaestus occupies his specific seat. His presence there is not anomalous in Hesiod's account. He is the son of Zeus and Hera. He belongs to the first generation of Olympians. His position is secured by birth in the most standard possible way. What Hesiod's account does not emphasize is the emotional texture of his relationship to the divine family, the warmth and the intimacy that Homer's forge scene carries. Hesiod's Hephaestus has a genealogy. Homer's Hephaestus has a mother. Both of these things are true about a god, or can be. A god can have a formal position in a cosmic order and also a relationship with another divine figure that carries the specific weight of closeness and debt and long familiarity. The two accounts of Hephaestus are perhaps not so much contradictory as they are complementary, telling different things about the same being, one from the outside and one from inside the forge, one with the orderly distance of a genealogist, and one with the warm proximity of a scene fully inhabited. What changes between them is not the god. What changes is the angle from which he is seen. Around fires at separate festivals, in different regions of the ancient Aegean world, different communities maintained different versions of this tradition. A storyteller on one island might have known only the Homeric version, received through the long oral tradition of Homeric performance that circulated the epics across the Greek world for centuries before they were fixed in the form we have now. A storyteller somewhere else might have known Hesiod's account, drawn from the Theogony's systematic articulation of divine genealogy. Neither might have known in any conscious way that the other's version differed. Each would have told the story they knew with complete earnestness, and their communities would have received it as the true account, the way the birth of this god was understood to have happened. This is not a failure of communication or a gap in the tradition's coherence. It is simply the nature of a tradition that moves through a wide geography over a long time. The Greek world of the archaic and classical periods was not a single unified culture with a single unified canonical text. It was hundreds of communities scattered across the Aegean and Mediterranean worlds, sharing a language and a general set of divine figures, but maintaining their own local practices, their own local emphases, their own local versions of stories that were in broad outline shared. The gods traveled across this world in many forms. They arrived different in different places. They were received differently, and they were, in the end, recognizably themselves wherever they went. Hephaestus, in the Homeric tradition, is a god who speaks of his mother with intimacy. In the Hesiodic tradition, he is a god with a father and a secure place in divine genealogy. In both traditions, he is the smith of the gods, the worker in fire and metal, the one whose hands made the objects the other gods depended on. His craft is not in dispute between the two accounts. His lameness, which the tradition describes in ways that will emerge fully as this story moves forward, is attested across sources with a consistency the birth accounts do not share. The forge is the constant. The fire is the constant. The god with his tools and his particular way of making things is the constant that the two contradictory birth accounts both open toward. In the great hall of the Library of Alexandria, some centuries after Homer and Hesiod had both been composed, a scholar unrolls two papyrus scrolls across a reading surface in the lamp-lit quiet of the library's interior. The light in the room is the particular gold of oil lamps, burning steadily in a contained space, warm and slightly amber and wholly unlike daylight. One scroll carries the Homeric lines, Hephaestus speaking to Hera with the closeness of a son, the forge behind him, the emotional current between them steady and real. The other carries the Hesiodic genealogy, Zeus and Hera, the generation of the Olympians, Hephaestus placed among them with the precision of a divine register. The scholar reads both. The room is quiet except for the sound of the papyrus unrolling and the faint distant sounds of the city beyond the library's walls. There is no urgency in this reading. The scrolls have been here for some time, and the scholar has time. What the two accounts say about where Hephaestus came from does not align. The scholar notes this, as others have noted it before, with the equanimity of someone accustomed to the way the tradition handles its own contradictions. Both of these accounts were believed, both were recited, both traveled through the ancient world in the mouths of performers and the hands of scribes, and arrived here, at this library, carried inside the material of the papyrus like something preserved in amber. The scholar sets both scrolls down, neither cancels the other. In the Homeric version, there is a forge and a mother, and an intimacy that sounds more like the warmth of an ordinary human relationship than like the formal bond of cosmic genealogy. In the Hesiodic version, there is an ordered family of divine powers, and a god with a father and a proper place in the structure those powers maintain. In both versions, the forge fires. In both, the god is at work. The scrolls lie side by side on the reading surface, and neither of them is wrong in the way that would require the other to be discarded. This is the particular quality of the Greek mythological tradition that the Library of Alexandria, perhaps more than anywhere else in the ancient world, made visible, that the tradition was not a single story, and that the gods it described were larger than any single account of them. The Greeks made room for irresolvable things. They did not always reach for the reconciling explanation. Sometimes they held the contradiction itself, turned it over, noted it carefully, and returned both versions to their shelves with the equanimity of people who understood that a tradition this old and this wide was going to contain more than any single telling could accommodate. Hephaestus then arrives in this story carrying two origins. In one, he is the son of his mother alone, made without a father, bound to Hera by a closeness that the warmth of the forge makes palpable, his existence a kind of divine self-generation that places him at the particular intersection of independence and intimacy. In the other, he is the son of both divine parents, a product of the standard cosmological order, his genealogy placed in the careful ledger of Hesiod's divine accounting. He carries both of these origins through the tradition, and neither weighs more than the other, and the god who walks between them is wholly himself in either account. The firelight in Book 18 of the Iliad is steady and warm. Hephaestus speaks to his mother, and his voice has the quality of long familiarity, of someone who has been in this relationship long enough that the words between them move without effort, without formality, without the performance of significance. Festus is waiting. The forge is hot. Around them, the bronze tools and the bellows and the work of the smith's hands make the room what it is. The particular, specific, inhabited room of a god who works with his hands and lives inside the evidence of what those hands have made. Somewhere else in the ancient world, in the version that Hesiod received and wrote down, the same god appears in a different frame, named in a genealogy, placed in an ordered structure, given a father and a lineage that connect him to the broadest pattern of divine succession the tradition maintained. He is there too, in that ordered light, his name inscribed among the children of Zeus and Hera, his position in the family of the gods settled and clear. Both of these Hephaestuses are the same god. Both of these stories are the same story, told from different angles, in different voices, to different communities around different fires. Two scrolls, side by side, in the lamplit quiet of a great library. Neither of them wrong, neither of them complete without the other. Between them, if you hold them both at once and let your attention settle, something like the full shape of the god begins to emerge, not from the resolution of the contradiction, but from the space the contradiction itself opens up. The Greeks were comfortable with that space. They made room for it in their libraries, and in their commentaries, and in the patient, careful attention of the scholars who read both accounts and noted the difference, without deciding which one to discard. The two scrolls rest on the surface of the reading table in the amber light, and outside the library walls, the city of Alexandria goes about its business. And somewhere much older and much further away in time, on the hillside where Homer's tradition was first sung, into the form that eventually made its way onto one of those scrolls, Hephaestus is at his forge, and his mother is there, and the fire is warm, and the story of where he came from is already being told in more than one way, and will go on being told in more than one way for a very long time, and the tradition is large enough to hold all of it, and has always been. The light in the library does not waver. The scrolls do not resolve their disagreement. The god continues, in both of them being himself, working, making, speaking in the voice of a son, toward the figure his tradition calls his mother, standing in the genealogy of the Olympians with Zeus, acknowledged as his father, occupying the same forge in both accounts, the same fire, the same brightness of bronze tools in the warm light of a god who works with his hands. Both versions of this god were believed somewhere. Both were recited. Both arrived at the library in Alexandria and were held side by a scholar with patience and curiosity, and no particular investment in choosing between them. That is perhaps the most faithful thing that can be said about the tradition. It held more than it resolved, and it found in the holding not confusion, but something more like the quiet pleasure of an interesting complexity, turned over slowly in the hands in the good light, with time enough to look at it properly. In the first book of the Iliad, Hephaestus speaks of his fall in a voice that carries no trembling in it. He is standing among the gods, wine cup in hand, moving from one seated figure to the next, and he tells what happened to him the way a man describes a road he once traveled, with the careful precision of someone who knows the distance well, who has had long years to learn the shape of it. His mother Hera is there. There is a quarrel in the air between her and Zeus, the particular tightness that settles over divine gatherings when the two most powerful figures in them are not at peace with each other. Hephaestus moves between them with his cup, and he speaks, and what he says is not a complaint, it is a memory. It is the account of a morning he left the mountain, and a long afternoon descending through the open air before the island received him, still and solid, at the end of a day's falling. He describes Zeus catching him by the foot. That is the detail Homer preserves, the grip, the lifting, the threshold of Olympus passing overhead as the god went over it and began the long arc downward through the sky. The cause of it was Hera. Hephaestus had tried to intercede on her behalf, to step between his mother and the displeasure of the king of the gods, and Zeus had answered the intervention with an action so large and so complete that no further argument was possible. The morning sky of the divine realm opened beneath him. He fell into it. There is another version, older in its origins and different in its shape, in which the one who throws is not Zeus but Hera herself, and the one thrown is not a grown god who has dared to intervene in a divine quarrel, but an infant found imperfect at the moment of birth. In the account preserved by Apollodorus, Hera looks at what she has produced and finds it wanting, and acts on that finding without delay. The infant goes over the edge of Olympus the way something unnecessary is removed, with the brisk efficiency of a decision already made. In this version there is no quarrel, no intervention, no specific mourning when a particular choice was made. There is only the assessment and its consequence. These two versions do not resolve into each other. They remain separate, each preserved in its own tradition, each earnest and each believed. In one, the fall is the price of loyalty. In the other, it is the result of imperfection. In one, Hephaestus is a grown god who chooses to act and suffers for the choice. In the other, he is an infant who has not yet chosen anything, and the world he enters at the bottom of his fall will be the world he has been given rather than the one from which something was taken. The two accounts sit beside each other in the tradition the way two versions of the same event often do, not canceling, not explaining, simply coexisting in the enormous space the old stories make for themselves. What both versions share is the fall itself, the downward motion through air that is no longer divine air, the slow or sudden departure from the summit of Olympus, and the long passage toward whatever ground was waiting. And in the Iliad, it is Hephaestus himself who gives the fall its most extraordinary quality, its detail that ancient commentators return to again and again when they tried to say what the myth was really about. He says that he fell all day, that from the first light of morning, when Zeus or the threshold of Olympus released him, to the amber hour of late afternoon, when the Aegean sun was already moving toward the water, all of that time, every hour of it, was occupied by the fall. The island of Lemnos grew from nothing to a specific and solid reality beneath him across the course of an entire day's descent. Ancient readers of the Iliad who paused on this detail were pausing on something cosmological. The distance implied by a day's falling is not the distance between one floor and another, not even the distance a stone covers when thrown from a great height. A full day's fall is a span of measurement that belongs to the structure of the universe. It says something about where Olympus sits in relation to the earth, about the gulf that exists between the place where the divine reside and the ground that ordinary things strike when they fall. Hephaestus falls for a day, and what that day represents is the full width of the space between what is divine and what is not. His landing is not simply arrival, it is the moment when that full distance has been crossed, when a god has traversed the entire gap between two orders of being and come to rest at the bottom of it. The island below him, growing slowly visible across those long hours, was Lemnos. It lies in the northern Aegean Sea, not far from the coast of Thrace, and its landscape had already earned a reputation in the ancient world for the kind of phenomena that connect to fire and heat and the particular powers of the Earth's interior. Ancient sources note the volcanic character of its terrain, the presence of natural fires in its geology, the ways in which the island seemed already prepared by its own nature to be the home of a god whose domain was the forge. The island was receiving the smith before it knew it was receiving anyone. The fire in its rock was already there. Hephaestus does not describe what the falling felt like from the inside. Homer gives him the detail of duration, the whole day, from morning's edge to the approaching dusk, and lets that duration do the work of conveying what a fall of such distance and such length must have been. There is no description of wind, no account of the sensation of air moving against the god's body, no moment of panic or orientation. There is only the time, the enormity of the time, the full breadth of a day's light, holding a single sustained motion, a single arc from the highest point in the cosmos to a particular island's particular shoreline, the trajectory of one expelled god, crossing all of that sky in the span between one morning and one evening. In the tradition Homer preserves in the 18th book of the Iliad, Hephaestus speaks of being received, after his landing, by the sea nymph Thetis. He remembers her presence with the specificity of someone describing the first warmth they found after a long cold, her attention, her care, the years that followed in which she came to him and he made things for her. Thetis is silver-armed in Homer's descriptions, which is how she is always described, and there is something fitting in the image of those silver arms bending over the place where the god came down, finding him in whatever state the landing left him, beginning the quiet work of recovery. What Hephaestus owes to Thetis as he recounts it is considerable. She was there when the divine community had not been. She received him when Olympus had released him. There is also in the same long tradition a second group who receive him. The Sintians of Lemnos are named in the Iliad's first book, a pre-Greek people associated with the island, present in the oldest layers of the tradition's memory. When Hephaestus recalls the day Zeus threw him and the landing on Lemnos, it is the Sintians who are there on the shore. Ancient scholars who noticed the tension between Thetis receiving him and the Sintians receiving him did not flatten the contradiction. They read it as evidence of layered stories, different traditions deposited into the text at different times, each one preserving a genuine part of what the myth once held in its fuller form. In one layer, the figure at the water's edge is a sea nymph with silver arms who will become one of the most important relationships in his long divine career. In another, it is a community of people who knew the island, who were present at the shoreline when something extraordinary arrived, and who responded with the practical steadiness of those who have learned to receive what the world sends without excessive ceremony. Both of these receptions are worth holding in the mind at the same time, the divine and the human presence at the landing place, each carrying something the other does not. Thetis brings the care of a being who can recognize a god and knows how to tend to one. The Sintians bring the solidity of ground, the reassurance of people standing on earth that does not move, the wordless testimony that the island is real and the fall is over. Hephaestus, between them, is in some sense between two worlds at once, received by the divine in the form of a nymph, and received by the mortal in the form of a people, the god who fell from the highest place into the most ordinary ground, held at the margin between both. The island of Lemnos, seen from a great height on a clear Aegean morning, has the quality of something precise and deliberate laid into a very wide sea. Its coastline is specific, its volcanic terrain particular to itself, its relationship to the water around it defined by the long flat plains of light that move across the northern Aegean at the hours when the sun is still low. From a sufficient height, from a height that belongs to the scale of a day's falling, an island of that size would appear for a long time as a small thing and then grow, hour by hour, into something large enough to be real. The pale stone of its higher ground would catch the afternoon light in the particular way that pale stone does when the sun has been traveling across it for several hours. The sea around it would be darkening at its depths and bright at its surface in the way the Aegean is bright in the late hours of the afternoon. A god falling toward that island for an entire day would have had time to see all of this, the gradual acquisition of detail, the coastline assembling itself out of the general suggestion of land into something with specific edges and specific colors, the volcanic character of the terrain becoming visible in the particular gray and red and ochre of its rock, the sea below growing from a flat and distant brightness into individual waves with individual shapes and individual heights, the god descending toward all of this across the full breadth of a day, the light changing around him as the hours moved, Olympus receding behind and above until it was no longer visible, the island ahead and below growing into the only destination available. That Lemnos was associated with fire long before the myth of Hephaestus arrived had made the landing feel, in the ancient imagination, less like accident and more like correspondence. The island that received the divine smith was already an island of heat and volcanic depth. Its ground carried within it something related to what Hephaestus would carry in himself, the connection to the earth's interior, the forge quality of stone that has been shaped by pressure and heat rather than by water and time. When the god came down onto Lemnos, the myth seems to say he came down onto ground that was already prepared for him by what it was. In the version of the story where it is Hera who casts the infant, the fall has a different quality, not the long arc of a grown god, expelled in a particular moment of divine anger, but the brief and terrible trajectory of something very small released from a very great height. An infant falling from Olympus would not have the resources to observe the descent, to note the duration, to carry the memory of the fall as a story to be told later. The infant version of the casting is told by others, not by the god himself. Apollodorus holds it in the third person. Here is what happened. Here is what was decided. Here is where the child landed. The absence of Hephaestus's own voice in that version gives it a different weight. It is the account of something done to him before he could be a witness to it. What remains consistent across both traditions is the landing, whether he fell all day as a grown god or in a moment as an infant. He arrived. The island was there. The ground received him. And from whatever condition the landing left him in, there was recovery, a figure or figures who found him, who tended to him, who began the long and ordinary process of continuation that follows any catastrophic interruption. The fall ends. That is the structural fact both versions share, and it is perhaps the most important thing either of them holds. The fall ends, and the landing is not the end of the story, but the beginning of a different one. The god expelled from the divine community comes to rest on an island in the northern Aegean, and then the question shifts, not how did he fall, but what does he do with the ground beneath him? The slow arc of that fall, held at the scale the Iliad gives it, is worth staying with a little longer. A day's falling is not simply a large quantity of falling. It is a day, the same unit of time that structures human life, the same span from light to dark that governs every ordinary and extraordinary human event. To fall through an entire day is to be suspended in the time of human life while moving through the space between divine and mortal existence. The day does not hurry. The sun moves through it at the same pace it always moves. The light changes from morning's pale blue to midday's brightness to the amber slant of late afternoon, exactly as it always does. And through all of that change, through every phase of the day's light, the god is still in the air. There is something about that duration that keeps the event from being an instant, from being the kind of thing that is over before it is fully apprehended. The cast is a moment. The fall is a day. The god who goes over the edge of Olympus in a moment of divine violence enters on the other side of that moment into something long and unhurried and full of time. He has an entire day to be in the fall before the fall is over. The Aegean morning gives way to the Aegean afternoon. The light that was white and high becomes gold and long, and the island below is growing, acquiring detail, becoming real. The Sintians on the shore in the Iliadic account are simply there when he arrives. They are not described preparing for his arrival, not looking up at the sky and watching the descent. They are simply present at the place where the god lands, and they receive him. In the ancient world, the Sintians were understood to be among the oldest inhabitants of Lemnos, pre-Greek in their language and their customs, a people who had been on the island long enough to be part of its oldest mythological layer. The tradition that places them at the landing site of Hephaestus may be one of the oldest threads in the whole fabric of the story, older than the Homeric text that preserves it, older than the particular political or religious contexts that shape different versions of the myth in different periods and places. To place a pre-Greek people at the moment of the god's arrival is to place the myth in a time before Greece, as Greece understood itself. The Sintians receive Hephaestus before the world of the Olympians has fully formed its settled order. They are, in the logic of the myth, there at a founding moment, present when the divine smith, who will build so much of what the gods use and inhabit, first touches mortal ground. What they do with him after that is not described in the Iliadic account. The text gives them their presence on the shore and then moves forward, the way myths often move, naming the important moment and then allowing the continuation to be implied. At the shoreline of Lemnos in the amber light of the late afternoon, with the long fall finished and the ground solid and specific beneath everything, there is a quality of stillness that follows the motion of the day. The water around the island continues to move. The light on it continues to shift, but whatever was falling has stopped. Whatever motion occupied the full length of that Aegean day has come to its end at this particular piece of ground, on this particular shoreline, among the people who were already there when it arrived. The fall, described at the scale Homer gives it, has the quality of a cosmological statement rather than a biographical misfortune. It says something about the distance between where gods live and where things land when they fall. It says something about the nature of that distance, not simply spatial but qualitative, the full difference between divine residence and mortal ground, the complete traversal of that difference, taking the time of a whole day's light. Hephaestus crosses that distance. He arrives at the bottom of it, and the island receives him the way islands receive things, with the patient, impersonal solidity of ground that has been there longer than anything that has just arrived on it. The sea around Lemnos, in the late afternoon of a clear Aegean day, would be the color of old bronze in the places where the sunlight still reached it, and darker elsewhere, trending toward the deep blue that the northern Aegean carries in its deeper water. The coastline would be the color of the volcanic stone that makes the island's character, gray and red, and the particular ochre of rock that has spent a long time near heat. These are not beautiful colors in the way of a painter's landscape. They are honest colors, the colors of a real place with a real geology, the colors that a god who governed the forge might find familiar. When Hephaestus, in the first book of the Iliad, recounts all of this to Hera, he does not speak of it as a wound that has not healed. He speaks of it as something that occurred, something he carries, something that explains the particular shape of his relationship to Thetis and the particular gratitude in that relationship. His voice in Homer is mild. It is the mildness of someone who has arrived at a way of holding a difficult thing, not by diminishing it, but by learning its dimensions so well that carrying it no longer requires the same effort it once did. He knows exactly how far he fell. He knows exactly how long it took. He knows who was there when he arrived. These are the features of a memory that has been lived with, rather than avoided, turned over many times until its edges are known. The island that received him went on being itself after he arrived. The volcanic ground of Lemnos did not change its character to accommodate the presence of the fallen smith. The stone remained the color it had been. The heat in the rock continued at its own temperature. The sea around the island continued to move in its own patterns. Whatever recovery Hephaestus made on that ground, he made it alongside a landscape that was indifferent to him in the most elemental sense, a landscape that was simply what it was, geological and coastal and northern Aegean, offering nothing but its own particular reality as a place to begin again. There is, in that indifference, something that might have suited him. A god whose domain is the forge knows the quality of material that does not accommodate to the maker's preferences, that has to be worked with according to its own nature, heated to the right temperature, shaped at the right moment, cooled in the right medium. The island of Lemnos, with its volcanic stone and its fire phenomena and its cold northern Aegean Sea, was material of that kind. It did not offer ease, it offered what it had. And what it had was ground, solid, specific, geologically articulate ground, which was what was needed most after a day spent in the air. The Sintians on the shore, in the late afternoon light, are standing on that ground. They have been standing on it, or ground very like it, all their lives. They know its quality. They know what the island gives and what it withholds. When something arrives on the shore with the force and the particularity of something that has fallen from a very great distance, the practical steadiness that the ancient tradition attributes to them would be exactly what the moment required. Not awe, not ceremony, not the elaborate reception of a divine figure, simply the presence of people who know how to manage what arrives, who have the particular competence of those who live close to the sea and understand that things come in on tides and with storms and sometimes under their own power, and that all of them require a response. The day has ended. The gold of the Aegean afternoon is moving into the first gray of the approaching evening, the light on the water changing from its late afternoon brightness to something softer and more diffuse. The fall is over. It has been over since the moment the island received the god, but the ending of it settles more fully into the air as the light changes, as the day that held the fall from its beginning moves through its last hour toward dark. Hephaestus is on the ground. The Sintians are on the ground beside him. The Hephaestus, in another layer of the same tradition, is somewhere near the water's edge, her silver arms present in the last of the light. The island holds the stillness of a place that has absorbed something very large and is simply continuing. The volcanic stone under everyone's feet is the same temperature it was before the god arrived. The sea continues its movement against the coastline with the same unhurried rhythm. The northern Aegean sky above Lemnos is moving toward its first stars. The particular clarity of that sky at the edge of evening giving the stars, when they come, an unusual precision. The fall has ended in the only way any fall can end, in the solid and specific fact of arrival, the ground rising to meet what was falling, the long motion through air becoming the simple stillness of rest. The Sintians of Lemnos received what arrived on their shore at the end of that long descending day. Their feet were on the ground, the god was among them, the island was itself, volcanic, northern, fire-charactered, ancient. And the day that had held the entirety of that great arc from the height of the divine to the solidity of the mortal was done, its light spent, the first cool of the Aegean evening beginning to move in from the water, the island settling into the quiet that comes after a day of unusual light, the shore at rest under the first hesitant stars. In the great hall of Olympus, Hephaestus moved through the assembled gods with a wine vessel in his hands and a gait that did not move in straight lines. The other Olympians watched him make his slow, uneven circuit of the tables. Homer describes the scene in the first book of the Iliad with a lightness of tone that is worth attending to, not because the laughter of the gods was kind, but because the scene is not, in Homer's telling, a scene of cruelty. It is something more complicated than that. The god of the forge was serving wine, and he was limping as he served it, and the assembled company of heaven found this funny, and the narration holds all of that together without collapsing it into either comedy or tragedy. The Greek word Homer uses is kolos. It means lame or limping, and it recurs wherever Hephaestus is in motion in the epics, not as an epithet of shame, but as a simple descriptor, the way another god might be described by the color of their eyes or the quality of their voice. In the Iliad, Hephaestus is the god who limps. It is as much a part of who he is as his forge, as his bronze hands, as the heat that gathers wherever he works. The physical condition is not a footnote to his identity. It is among the first things the tradition reaches for when it wants to place him in a room. The question of where the lameness came from is one that the tradition holds in its characteristic way, not with a single answer, but with two, each consistent with a different account of how Hephaestus arrived at his place in the world. If the tradition that names Hera as the one who cast the infant god from the heights of Olympus is followed, then the lameness came first. She saw the child she had made and found him imperfect, and what she did with that perception was throw him from the mountain. The fall in this version is the consequence of the deformity. The god was born marked in some way that his mother could not accept, and the casting followed from that, and the island of Lemnos received something that was already broken when it arrived. If instead the tradition preserved in the first book of the Iliad is followed, Hephaestus's own account of being seized by the foot and flung from Olympus by Zeus in a fit of divine anger, then the lameness is the consequence of the landing. The god was whole when he fell and broken when he stopped falling. The island received something that the impact itself had marked. What both versions preserve, whatever sequence of cause and effect they prefer, is the same image at their center, a god whose body and whose history of displacement are inseparable facts about the same figure. Whether the body caused the fall or the fall made the body, the two things belong to each other. The tradition understood that. It did not try to clean the knot loose. It let the two threads run alongside each other and called them both part of the story. In the first book of the Iliad, when Hephaestus has finished his awkward circuit of the feasting tables, and the laughter of the Olympians has settled into something like affection, or at least a kind of fond familiarity with the sight of him, he speaks with a wry directness that has something in it of a man who has learned to carry an old fact without being crushed by it. He knows what his gait looks like. He knows what it provokes. His response to the Olympians' laughter is not anger or grief, but something more like patience, the patience of someone who has been carrying a thing for long enough that it no longer surprises them, and who has found, somewhere in the long carrying, a way to hold it that does not hurt. The scene Homer builds is brief and domestic, and in its own way, quietly warm. The fire is behind him. The wine is in his hands. The gods are laughing, but they are also watching him, and the attention they give him has in it a recognition that is different from how they watch each other. He is singular among them in a way that goes beyond his craft. The scholars of antiquity noticed the lameness, and in the manner of ancient philosophy, declined to leave a physical fact unexplained. The Stoic thinkers in particular offered an interpretation that has a certain elegance to it, the elegance of a reading that sees in the body of a god the behavior of the element he governs. Fire does not move in straight lines. It does not track directly from its source to its destination. It lurches sideways, climbs unevenly, bends in directions that are not planned, falls back on itself, and then rises again. Fire's movement is asymmetrical in exactly the way that a limp is asymmetrical. A forward motion that accommodates an irregularity, that incorporates deviation into its progress and still arrives. The Stoic allegorists looked at Hephaestus limping and saw fire moving. They looked at fire moving and saw Hephaestus. The connection between the craftsman's body and his element was not incidental to them. It was the tradition thinking, in its oblique mythological way, about how the god and the thing he governs belong to the same pattern. This kind of reading Finding in the god's physical form a statement about the nature of the thing he controls is one of the characteristic moves of Stoic mythological interpretation. It did not require them to take the myths as literal history. What it required was the attention to see that a body described consistently across centuries of storytelling had accumulated meaning in the act of being repeated. Every time a poet described Hephaestus moving with his uneven gait, every time a painter depicted his turned foot on a vase or a frieze, the tradition was reinforcing an image that it found useful. The lameness stayed in the story because it was doing something. The Stoics made explicit what the repeated image implies, that the god's form and the god's function rhyme with each other in a way that makes the tradition feel not arbitrary, but deeply considered. There is a parallel tradition, geographically very distant, that holds similar shapes. In the Old Norse Völunnark Vita, a poem from the corpus of Old Norse literature describing the master smith Völundar, known in the English tradition as Wayland, the divine craftsman, is similarly marked by physical difference. Völundar's lameness and physical compromise are central to his story in ways that echo, without borrowing from, the Hephaestian tradition. The scholar Walter Burkert, working on cross-cultural patterns in ancient mythology, identified the connection between divine or legendary smiths and physical disability as a pattern that appears across multiple independent traditions, and proposed that behind the mythological detail lies a historical one. Ancient metalworking, including the particularly demanding work of bronze and iron smithing, carried real occupational hazards. Prolonged exposure to the arsenic compounds used in early bronze production caused peripheral neuropathy, a kind of nerve damage that presents in the limbs. Smiths, in the ancient world, were understood to be people whose bodies bore the marks of their work. The god of the forge carried in his body an image of the actual condition of the craftsman who worshipped him. The idea that the divine smith's lameness is a mythological encoding of something observed about real smiths, men whose bodies were shaped and marked by the specific violence of metalwork, does not diminish the mythological image. It deepens it. The gods of any tradition are built, at some level, from the specific materials of the culture that made them. The culture looks at the men who work the forges and sees in their bodies the traces of enormous heat and force and skill. It looks at its god of fire and gives him those same traces. The myth is not explaining the craftsman's condition. The craftsman's condition is what gave the myth its form. The lameness of Hephaestus and the lameness of Voland and the physical compromise of smith figures across many traditions share a root that is not supernatural but earthy and specific and observed. The long, accumulating cost of standing near great heat and working metal with the strength of the body over a whole life. But the forge on Olympus that Homer describes is not a place of depletion. It is a place of tremendous directed energy. And the thing that Hephaestus made to address the particular challenge of his body's unevenness is one of the most remarkable details in all of the Homeric epics. Remarkable not because it strains credibility within the tradition, which is after all populated by divine beings doing impossible things, but because of what it implies about the way the tradition imagined the relationship between disability and creative response. In the 18th book of the Iliad, Homer describes Hephaestus at work in his forge on Olympus and includes in that description a detail that has no exact parallel elsewhere in the epics. Alongside the automatic bellows that tend their fires without a hand to work them, alongside the extraordinary objects in various stages of completion, Homer places at Hephaestus's side a group of golden female figures. They are fashioned from metal. They are made by his own hands, and they are not decorative. Homer describes them as possessing nous, intelligence, and the capacity for speech and skilled work. They move, they respond, they support him as he moves through the forge on his uneven legs. They are, in the most literal sense available to Homeric Greek, something like thinking servants made of gold. The scholar Adrienne Mayer, in her detailed study of artificial beings in ancient Greek tradition, has identified this passage as one of the earliest descriptions of what we would now call mechanical artificial beings in Western literature, figures imagined as possessing some of the functional properties of living creatures, while being clearly the products of making rather than birth. The tradition did not find this surprising. Homer introduces the golden women without fanfare, as a detail about how the forge is organized, as one of the things that Hephaestus built, because he needed them and because he had the skill to build them. The quality of these figures, as Homer describes them, is worth staying with for a moment. They are golden, not gilded, not decorated in gold, but gold in their substance, the same material from which Hephaestus builds things that he means to last. They possess intelligence. That is not a metaphor Homer is using. The Greek is clear. He gives them nous, the word used elsewhere in the epics for the cognitive capacity of persons, human and divine. He gives them the ability to speak and to do skilled work. The gap between these figures and a living being is a gap of origin rather than a gap of capability. They were made, not born, and the act of making is what distinguishes them from the beings who move around them in the divine world. What Hephaestus built was not a tool, it was a company, something to work alongside and something to lean on in the most practical sense, because his legs, reliable as they were in their asymmetrical way, did not give him the same ease of movement that the other Olympians possessed, and the god who could make anything made what he needed. There is a particular quality to the image of the golden women standing beside Hephaestus in the forge that does not disappear the more it is examined. It is not the quality of pathos, of the disabled god compensating for what he lacks with clever artifice. The tradition does not frame it that way. The golden helpers are not evidence of limitation, they are evidence of capacity. The same hands that could not move through the world with the same ease as the other Olympians could make beings that moved with perfect ease, that were intelligent and capable and present in exactly the ways that were needed. The forge that produced the shield of Achilles and the palace of Hephaestus and the bronze giant Talos also produced, quietly and as a matter of practical necessity, thinking figures made of gold. The same skill, the same hands, the same fire. In the centuries after Homer, the tradition continued to pay attention to those golden figures, and to others like them that Hephaestus was said to have made. The mechanical beings attributed to him accumulated in the ancient imagination as a category, things built to have qualities of life without being alive in the way that living things are alive. Talos, the bronze giant who walked the perimeter of Crete in the account preserved by Apollonius of Rhodes, was one of these. The tripods that Hephaestus describes in the 18th book of the Iliad as moving on their own to and from the feasts of the gods were another. The tradition was building, across many generations of storytelling, an image of the divine forge as a place where the categories of made and alive were not as fixed as they are elsewhere. This is worth dwelling on, not as a matter of ancient technology or proto-scientific thought, but as a mythological image. The forge is the place where things are made. Fire and skill and force transform raw material into something that did not exist before. In the tradition's understanding of Hephaestus, this capacity for transformation extended to the boundary between made things and living things. He was the craftsman who worked at the place where those categories became uncertain. The golden women who supported him as he walked were made, but they thought, they spoke, they could do the things that skilled workers do. The tradition that gave them these qualities was the same tradition that gave Hephaestus his limp, and it was interested in both things equally, as facts about a god who occupied an unusual position in the divine world, who had been thrown from the center of it, and had built something extraordinary in the place where he landed. The image of Hephaestus that persists across the Iliad is not the image of a god diminished by his physical condition. It is the image of a god who has organized the world around him with remarkable precision. The forge is warm and busy and well managed. The bellows work by themselves. The golden women move alongside him. The objects under construction represent a kind of ongoing, tireless creativity that the other Olympians, with their serene feasting and their disputes and their interventions in mortal affairs, do not demonstrate in the same way. The other gods act in the world. Hephaestus makes things for it. His relationship to existence is productive in a way that the tradition marks as unusual, as something that belongs specifically to him and to the quality of his particular position in the divine community. The scene in Book 1 of the Iliad, in which the Olympians laugh at his limping circuit of the hall, is framed as a domestic moment, the quarrel between Zeus and Hera that Hephaestus has been trying to quiet is dissolved by laughter, by the incongruous sight of the divine smith serving wine with his uneven gait. The tension between the two most powerful figures in the Greek divine order, broken by something that is not dramatic at all, but simply visible and present. The lameness is, in this scene, functional. It does something in the story beyond establishing a physical detail. It brings the temperature of the room down. The Olympians stop quarreling and start laughing, and the moment passes, and the wine is served, and the fire burns on, and Hephaestus moves to his seat at the end of the circuit and sits down. He accomplished what he intended, in his own way, by his own means, moving at his own pace through the room, on his own terms. He addressed the thing that needed addressing. The tradition noticed that. It preserved the scene. It is not accidental that the god who has been thrown from the mountain twice, or once, or in some form that the two accounts together describe, is also the god whose presence has the power to change the atmosphere in a divine hall by the fact of his walking through it. The cross-cultural pattern that scholars, including Burkhardt, have traced through the divine and legendary smiths of multiple traditions rests on this same combination of elements: physical difference, extraordinary skill, the specific relationship between a body that does not move with ease through the world and a creative capacity that is in inverse proportion to that difficulty, vast. The Norse Fallander works in cold iron in a northern landscape, as far from the Aegean as it is possible to be within the tradition of European mythology, and yet the shape of his story rhymes with Hephaestus's in ways that feel, once noticed, structural rather than coincidental. Both figures are displaced, both are marked in their bodies, both work at a scale of craft that exceeds what the other figures around them can achieve. Both occupy a position in their respective divine or heroic worlds that is defined by the tension between the power of what they make and the particular difficulties of how they move. Scholars are careful about the question of what such parallels mean, whether they indicate genuine historical contact between the traditions, whether they reflect convergent responses to the same observed realities about metalworking and metalworkers, whether the pattern is so broadly human that it requires no specific explanation beyond the general fact that cultures tend to assign divine weight to what they depend on and fear. The question is genuinely open. What is not open is the observation itself that in traditions separated by considerable geographical and cultural distance, the figure of the divine craftsman is marked. The marking is part of what makes him divine in a particular way. The limp of Hephaestus and the physical compromise of Voland are not incidental biographical details. They are the tradition's way of saying that this kind of power, the power to transform raw material, to impose form on fire, to make things that last and things that think, does not come without cost, and the cost is worn in the body of the figure who possesses the power. The Stoic reading of Hephaestus's lameness as a figure for fire's uneven movement belongs to a later layer of interpretation than the Homeric depiction, but it is not discontinuous with it. The Stoics were reading the same poems that had been read for centuries before them, and they were asking a question that the tradition itself had been asking in its oblique, image-based way since the first telling. What is the relationship between the god's form and the god's function? Their answer, that the limp and the flame describe the same asymmetrical motion, is an interpretation, a reading, one way of making sense of a detail that the tradition preserved without explaining. Ancient traditions rarely explain their gods' physical forms. They describe them. The explanation is left to the attention of whoever is reading. The Stoics brought one kind of attention, other readers brought others. The image persisted through all of them, unchanged, available for each new pair of eyes to find something in. The golden figures are the counterpoint to the limp. They are what Hephaestus made in response to the specific conditions of his world, the specific challenges of his body, the specific requirements of a forge that needed to be managed well. They are not metaphors. Homer presents them as actual beings in the actual world of the poem, as real as Achilles and as real as Thetis, who will arrive at the forge's threshold to make her request, and will find the golden women and the working bellows already there, already doing their work, the forge already organized around the needs of the god who built it. Thetis arrives and the forge is running, the smith is there, the golden helpers are there, the fire is there, everything is as it should be, and the work is about to begin. The scene at the beginning of Book 18, where Thetis arrives at the bronze threshold of Hephaestus's workshop and finds it already in full operation, carries within it this image of the divine smith's world as self-sufficient. The forge does not wait for anything. The bellows work. The golden women work. Hephaestus works. His world is warm and busy and productive in a way that is entirely his own, organized by his intelligence and sustained by the things his intelligence made. The relationship between the craftsman and the golden figures who support him is not the relationship of the capable and the incapable. It is the relationship of a maker and his most characteristic making, the things built not for others, but for the internal economy of the workshop itself, for the purpose of keeping the forge alive and working and able to produce all the other things. What the tradition holds, across the Iliad and the later accounts and the allegorical interpretations and the cross-cultural resonances, is the image of a god who turned the conditions of his existence into the material of his work, the physical form that set him apart from the other Olympians, the kolos, the unevenness, the gate that moved through the divine hall in its own way, was not separate from his creativity. It was part of the same figure, the god who could not move through the world with the ease of the others, built a world inside his forge that moved with perfect ease, that was organized exactly as he needed it to be, that was populated with beings of his own making who extended his capability into the spaces his legs could not reach. The ancient Greek tradition was, in general, at ease with the idea that gods had bodies that expressed their natures. Aphrodite's beauty was not separate from her power over love. Artemis's swiftness was not separate from her power over the hunt. The physical form and the divine function were understood to belong to the same being in the same way, the body as a statement about what the god governed and how. Hephaestus, in his limping, forge-bright, golden-attended form, was a statement about what fire and craft and making actually are, not smooth, not orderly, in the way that the Olympian dining hall with its serene arrangements was orderly, but productive, asymmetrical, hot, attended by intelligent things that do not need explaining, organized around the ongoing fact of work. The golden women stand in the forge when the work pauses. Homer's description implies them as a continuous presence, rather than a one-time achievement. Not objects made and displayed, but beings made and present, part of the living organization of the workshop. After the bellows have settled, after the particular object under construction has been set aside or completed, they are there. Their intelligence, which Homer specifies, persists in the stillness between tasks. Their capacity for speech, which Homer also specifies, waits in the quiet of the forge for whatever will need to be said next. They are made of gold, which is to say, they are made of the most durable and the most valuable of the materials Hephaestus worked with. He made his helpers from the best thing he had. The fire in the forge diminishes when the bellows rest. The light it throws on the bronze walls and the golden figures changes as the heat reduces, the bright directional light of full operation becoming something quieter, something that catches the surface of the golden forms and holds it without the sharp definition that working heat provides. In that diminished light, the intelligence that Homer attributed to them persists unchanged. Whatever it is that the tradition meant by nous in this context, by the quality of thought it assigned to made beings of gold, it does not depend on the fire being at full height. It is a quality of the figures themselves, resident in their substance, present in the same way that the ability to speak and work is present, not activated by external conditions, but intrinsic. The smith made them capable, and the capability stayed. That quality of made and yet intelligent, of built and yet present, of created from the best materials by the most skilled hands, and then left to inhabit their own existence. That quality is what the tradition reached for when it tried to say what was most remarkable about what Hephaestus did in his forge. Not only the great objects, the shields in the palaces, and the automatons that walked the perimeters of islands, but also the quiet ones, the figures that supported him as he walked, the intelligence that stayed resident in gold in the stillness of a forge when the fire was low and the work was done, in the diminishing light of the Olympian forge, with the bellows at rest and the great objects set aside in their stages of completion, and the god himself gone from the room, the golden women stand in the warmth that remains. Their bright surfaces hold what light there is. Their intelligence, as Homer described it, is still present inside them, unhurried, capable, waiting with the specific patience of something made to last. The fire has banked low, but not gone out. The bronze walls of the forge reflect back what remains of the heat. The work is paused, which is different from the work being finished, and the golden women stand in the warm dark of that particular workshop, made by the best hands in the divine world, holding in their gold bodies the quality that Homer's Greek called nous, the capacity to think, to speak, to act with skill when the next thing is needed. They will be there when the fire rises again. They were made to be there. Everything in the forge was made to last, and they, most of all, were made to stay. At the threshold of Hephaestus's forge, Thetis arrived in the manner Homer describes her, arriving anywhere, silver-armed, unhurried, carrying with her the particular quality of the sea at its most still. She came because she needed something made. The heat of the forge met her at the door before she crossed it, the warmth rising from the bronze walls and the bellows and the fire in the center of the room, and she stood for a moment in that threshold between the cool air of Olympus and the working heat of the smith's domain, as though giving herself time to adjust to the world she was entering. Hephaestus was already at his labor. He had been moving through the forge in the measured, unhurried circuit of someone who knows every surface of the space they inhabit, who has spent enough time in a room to know it by weight and temperature rather than by sight. When he looked up from his work and recognized the sea nymph who had once sheltered him, who had once received him at the shore after the long fall and kept him safe through his recovery on Lemnos, the recognition moved through the room before either of them spoke. That debt between them had never required naming. It simply existed, warm and settled in the air of the forge, the way old obligations do when they have been kept faithfully and without resentment for a very long time. Homer describes the Thetis crossing the threshold and being greeted by Hephaestus with immediate warmth and the detailed hospitality of someone genuinely glad to see a welcome guest. He called for a chair to be brought. He set aside the work he was doing, the 20 tripods he had been fashioning to move on golden wheels by themselves, a detail that says as much about the scale of his daily ambitions as anything else in the Homeric account. The forge in Book 18 of the Iliad is a place of ongoing self-directed industry, where the objects being made at any given moment are themselves objects of extraordinary capability, and the smith who makes them does not appear to consider this remarkable. The 20 self-moving tripods were simply the work of the day, moving along on their golden wheels toward the assembly of the gods. He set them aside and turned his full attention to his guest, because the debt between them asked for nothing less. The bronze walls of the forge on Olympus are described by Homer with the same matter-of-fact precision he brings to the descriptions of palaces and battlefields. The structure is bronze, where the other divine dwellings are described as golden or marble. It is warm, where the halls of the feasting gods are cool and serene. It is a working place, full of the particular quality of a room that has been used for its intended purpose for a very long time, where everything is in the place it occupies, because it has proved itself useful in that place, and the organization of the space is the organization of a person who knows exactly what they are doing and has arranged their world accordingly. Within its walls, Hephaestus made things that had no equivalent anywhere else in the divine world. Not decrees, not prophecies, not blessings or curses, though his work was powerful enough to produce all of those effects. What he made were objects, specific, tangible, precisely engineered things that did what they were made to do, and did it with a completeness that suggested their maker had thought through every consequence before the first hammer fell. Thetis came to the forge with a request. Her son Achilles had lost his armor. It had been taken from the body of Patroclus, worn into battle and stripped away, and she had come to ask the smith to make something new. What Hephaestus made in response is described in a passage of Homeric epic, so long and so detailed that scholars have given it a specific name, ekphrasis. The term refers to the formal literary practice of describing a visual object so thoroughly that it becomes inside the poem a world contained within a world. The shield of Achilles is the most extended and most analyzed example of this practice in the entire Homeric tradition, and what it describes across several hundred lines of verse is not a weapon but a cosmology. The shield is layered. In its center, Homer places the earth and sky and sea, the sun in its motion, the moon in its phases, and the stars in their named and recognized positions. The Pleiades, the Hyades, Orion, and the bear that turns in place without ever setting below the horizon of the ocean. Around this center, he places two cities. One city is at peace, and in it there is a wedding procession moving through lamplit streets with singing and with music. And there is also a legal assembly where the elders sit and argue over a matter of restitution, two men disputing the weregild for a killing, and the crowd urging on either side. The other city is at war, and armies lay siege to its walls, and there are ambushes set at a river crossing, and cattle being driven off by soldiers who have come out of the hills. Around these two cities, Homer places fields in harvest, the grain falling in long rows, and the workers moving behind the reapers in the patient labor of the season, and a king standing at the edge of his field in silence, watching. Around the fields there is a vineyard heavy with grapes, and young men and women carrying the harvest in baskets and singing. Around the vineyard there is a herd of cattle being driven to water, and there is a lion taking one of the cattle, and the herdsmen are trying to drive the lion off, and their dogs circle but keep their distance. There is a pasture for white flocks. There is a dancing floor where young men and women move in a measured circle, and a singer in their midst playing the lyre. And around the entire shield, around the whole of this invented world, with its two cities, and its fields, and its vineyards, and its lions, and its dancers, Homer places the great river of the ocean running in a continuous band at the outermost rim, enclosing everything, as the ocean was understood to enclose the inhabited world. Hephaestus made this in a night, or so the tradition implies. By the time the shield is complete and the other armor is ready, and Hephaestus carries it away in the early morning to her son on the plain outside Troy. The forge produced it, and the forge was his, and what the forge could produce in a night was this: a world held in concentric rings of bronze and tin and gold and silver, depicting not warfare alone, but the full breadth of what human beings do and how they live and what happens between them, that a shield made for a warrior in the final days of a long siege should contain at its center a scene of ordinary legal deliberation in a peacetime city, and at its outer edge a dancing floor where no one is fighting, says something about what Hephaestus understood making to mean. The object was commissioned for a purpose. It served that purpose, and inside the service of that purpose it contained, precisely and without hurry, the entire world it was being sent into. The bronze walls of the forge held many such objects across the long tradition of Hephaestian mythology. Not all of them were made in generosity. The net described in Book 8 of the Odyssey belongs to a different order of motivation entirely, though its craftsmanship was no less complete. Hephaestus had learned that his wife Aphrodite was meeting with Ares in his own house, in his own bed, while he was understood to be absent. The tradition holds that he was informed by Helios, who sees everything from his circuit across the sky. What Hephaestus did with this information was precisely what Hephaestus always did with any problem that admitted a technical solution. He went to his forge. What he made there was a net of extraordinary fineness, threads spun to a gauge that made them invisible, arranged in a mesh strong enough to hold anything caught inside it, regardless of the strength applied to the attempted escape. The description in the Odyssey emphasizes its invisibility, the way its threads were finer than anything a weaver could produce on a loom, finer than sight. He spread this net across the bed and arranged it with the precision of someone who has thought through every angle of the trap, every point at which the mechanism might fail, every adjustment needed to ensure the thing works exactly as intended when the moment comes. Then he announced to the other gods that he was leaving for Lemnos, and he left, and he waited for what the trap was designed to catch. What followed when Ares and Aphrodite arrived, and the net drew closed around them, is one of the more comic episodes, preserved in either epic, the other gods called to witness the trapped pair, arriving with varying degrees of amusement and varying degrees of propriety, the whole scene playing out at the particular pitch of embarrassment that a well-executed trap produces when its mechanism works exactly as designed. Hephaestus achieved what he had set out to achieve. The restitution he demanded was the return of the gifts he had paid for Aphrodite as a bride price, and this was granted. The object made in the forge served its social and emotional purpose with the same completeness as the shield of Achilles served its martial one. What the tradition preserves in both of these objects is a consistent intelligence about what making means. The net is not a weapon in the ordinary sense. It causes no injury, draws no blood, achieves nothing through force. Its power is entirely architectural, the arrangement of its threads in a particular geometry that makes a certain space, once entered, impossible to leave. The craft is the whole of it. The workmanship is the whole of it. And in this, the net and the shield are not as different as they first appear, because the shield is also a constructed space, a world arranged inside a specific boundary that cannot be exceeded, holding everything it was designed to hold within the disciplined enclosure of its rings. Hephaestus made spaces. He made containers for things, for cosmic order, for warmth, for captured gods, for the preserved body of a warrior, for the divine community that ate and drank in the hall he had built and maintained. The form his creativity took was always the form of enclosure, of boundary, of a thing that was exactly as large as it needed to be, and no larger, with everything it needed inside it, and nothing extraneous admitted. Among all the things the tradition credits to his forge, the figure that perhaps most fully embodied these principles was the bronze giant Talos, described in Apollonius of Rhodes's Argonautica as a guardian made for Crete. The tradition holds that Hephaestus fashioned Talos, and that Zeus gave him to Minos to protect the island, and the account of how Talos was made and how he functioned has the quality of a technical specification rendered in mythological terms. He was bronze throughout, not a bronze surface over some other material, but bronze to his core, animated by a single vein of ichor, the fluid that moves through divine bodies in the place of blood. This vein ran from his throat to his ankle, where it was sealed by a nail or a pin, and the ichor's circulation through that single channel was the condition of his life. He walked the perimeter of Crete 3 times each day, completing his circuit of the island with the regularity of a mechanism whose purpose is maintenance and vigilance. The same walk made the same number of times in the same direction. The island held inside the ring of his patrol, as surely as the ocean held the world inside the outer ring of the shield. The Argonautica's account of Talos's end belongs to the story of Medea and the Argonauts, and what it describes is the precise identification and exploitation of the single point of vulnerability in a design that was otherwise without weakness. The nail at his ankle, the seal that kept the ichor in its channel, removed, it released what contained the giant's life, and the bronze body that had walked its patient circuit for however long it had been walking, dropped to the Cretan shore and was still. The tradition's understanding of how Talos worked is also an understanding of how he could be unmade, and both the working and the unmaking are about the same thing, the relationship between the boundary that holds a thing in its intended form and the consequence of that boundary's removal. Hephaestus built the boundary. The story is about what happens when it fails. This is the kind of story that the Hephaestian tradition generates consistently, not the power of force, but the power of the edge, the seal, the net's thread, the outer ring of the shield, the nail in the ankle that is also the condition of the giant's existence. The bellows in the forge on Olympus, as Homer describes them in Book 18 of the Iliad, worked by themselves. This detail arrives in the text without emphasis, as though it is simply a fact about the nature of the forge. There were 20 bellows arranged around the hearth, and when Hephaestus needed them to work, they worked, producing varying degrees of heat as the task required, the entire apparatus responding to the needs of the work without requiring anyone to tend it. The forge managed itself. The tools were intelligent in their function, which is to say, they were so perfectly made for their purpose that their operation required no additional attention. This is a different version of the same principle embodied in the golden automatons, the beings described elsewhere in the Iliad as fashioned by Hephaestus to support and assist him, female in form, made of gold, described by Homer as possessing intelligence, speech, strength, and knowledge of craft. The automatons moved alongside Hephaestus as he worked. They understood what was needed. They could speak and be spoken to. Their intelligence was not a mystery or a marvel that interrupted the description of the forge. It was simply a feature of the objects, noted alongside their golden material and their human form, as though the presence of intelligence in a well-made object was the natural outcome of sufficient attention brought to bear on the problem of making. There is a consistency in this across the Hephaestian tradition that becomes, when held at full length, a kind of argument. Everything Hephaestus made approached, in one way or another, the condition of self-sufficiency, the bellows that needed no hand, the tripods that moved on their own golden wheels, the automatons that could think and speak and work without direction, the net that held without any force being applied to it from outside, the shield that enclosed a complete world without requiring anything added to it from outside its own rings, the bronze giant that maintained his patrol without any instruction beyond the one he was built with. All of these objects share a single quality. Once made, they required nothing further from their maker. They were complete. They did what they were designed to do on the strength of how they were made, and the making was the whole of what was needed. The bronze palace of Hephaestus on Olympus is described by Homer as a place he built himself. This is a detail that stands apart from everything else on the mountain, because the divine palaces of Olympus are not otherwise described as the construction work of their inhabitants. They exist as divine things tend to exist in the Homeric world, without requiring explanation for how they came to be. But the home of Hephaestus was built by Hephaestus, which means it was not simply a place he lived, but a place he made, and the distinction carries a particular weight. Every joint in the bronze walls was his work. Every threshold and every lintel, every chamber and every corridor, every surface that reflected the light of the forge back into the room, all of it was the product of the same hands that made the shield and the net and the bronze giant and the golden women who moved beside him. He lived inside his own making. The palace was a self-portrait in metal, not in the sense of depicting its maker's face or form, but in the sense of encoding his maker's understanding of what a well-ordered space should be, what it should contain, how its parts should relate to one another, to produce the experience of being inside something that was designed for the life being lived inside it. To move through the palace of Hephaestus was to move through the organized thought of its maker. The warmth was distributed by design. The light came from the forge at the center, and spread through the rooms in the manner of a carefully managed fire, not random but arranged. The structure stood on the mountain of the gods, and was, among all the structures there, the only one that could be said to reflect the mind and the hands of the person who inhabited it. The others were given, received, occupied, dwelt in. This one was made. The difference between occupying a space and making the space one occupies is the difference that defines Hephaestus across the whole tradition. He did not arrive at things already formed and settle into them. He arrived at the raw problem, the need for armor, the problem of an unfaithful wife, the requirement for a guardian at a coastline, the need for a place to live, and he solved it by imposing form on material in the particular way that form can be imposed when it is thought through completely before the first hammer falls. The shield of Achilles was made in a night, and in the morning Thetis carried it away across the damp air of the early hours toward Troy, and the smith returned to his 20 tripods on their golden wheels. The net hung in its place and was used, and was then presumably returned to the forge, or disposed of, or simply stored somewhere in the organized space of the bronze palace. Its purpose served. Talos walked his circuit, and then one day stopped walking, and the Cretan coastline held the shape of his patrols in the collective memory of whoever had watched him from the shore. The golden automatons moved alongside their maker through the forge and stood at rest when the work was done, their gold surfaces reflecting the fire in the measured steadiness of objects that do not require sleep or relief from their purpose. The bellows cooled. The tripods assembled themselves in the hall of the gods and returned to the forge afterward and lined up in their places, waiting for the next occasion they would be needed. The forge itself continued. This is perhaps the quality that holds the entire catalog of Hephaestian objects together most firmly, not the objects themselves, remarkable as each one is, but the forge from which they came, which was always in operation, always warm, always producing something in the process of becoming the thing it would eventually be. The shield was once ore, the net was once metal threads, with no particular arrangement. Talos was once molten bronze in a mold the size of a man, and before that, raw material extracted from the earth of wherever the earth was mined for the purpose. The golden automatons were once formless gold, and whatever intelligence they possessed was not present in the gold before it was worked, but was introduced by the working, was produced by the particular way the material was shaped and joined and given its form. Making was, in the Hephaestian tradition, not the imposition of the maker's will on a passive material, but a collaborative act between the knowledge of the smith and the properties of the material, each responding to the other until the thing that resulted was neither what the smith had imagined nor what the material could have produced alone, but something that could only exist as the product of that specific encounter. The bronze walls of the forge on Olympus held all of this without comment. The walls were also his work, also bronze, also shaped by the same hands that shaped everything else the tradition credits to him. Inside those walls, in the warm and purposeful light of the hearth, the objects of the Hephaestian catalog accumulated across the centuries of telling and retelling, each one added to the inventory by a different source, a different tradition, a different community that needed the smith to have made one more particular and extraordinary thing. Apollodorus added to what Homer preserved. Apollonius extended what earlier sources had established. The mythographic tradition that assembled itself around the figure of the divine smith over the long centuries of Greek religious and literary life was itself a kind of forge, a place where different materials were worked together until the figure that emerged from the combined effort was something no single source had fully described on its own. In the Iliad's Book 18, after Thetis has stated her request, and before Hephaestus has begun the work on the shield, there is a brief exchange between the sea nymph and the smith that carries more emotional weight than its length might suggest. She asks him for armor for her son. He agrees, and then he adds something, a wish that he could protect Achilles from the death that was already visible in the framing of the poem, the way the armor was needed, the way it was being commissioned, in the kind of haste that implies a particular urgency about time. He cannot make something to prevent the death. He can only make the armor, and he makes it with everything the forge can produce, which is considerable. The shield contains the world. The greaves and the breastplate and the helmet are made to the measure of the body that will wear them, fitted with the kind of precision that comes from a maker who understands what the object needs to do. All of this he makes for a man who will die, in the full knowledge that the making will not prevent the dying. What the forge can produce is not immunity from the conditions of existence. What the forge can produce is the most complete and carefully considered response to those conditions that making allows. The shield goes into the world. The world the shield depicts continues to be the world it depicts, cities at war and at peace, the harvest turning in its season, the dancers on their floor, the ocean at the rim of everything. And the shield holds it all, made in a night, in the bronze-walled forge on Olympus, carried across the damp early air toward a plain where a war had been going on for 10 years and would go on a little longer. The automatons stood in the forge after Thetis left. Their gold surfaces took the color of the fire and held it quietly, the way gold holds light, not reflecting it back sharply, as bronze does, but absorbing it slightly first, returning it warm. The bellows had slowed to the lower setting. The tripods waited in their places. The forge was warm and still, in the way that a workshop is still when the work of a particular intense session has been completed and the next task has not yet been begun. A stillness that is not absence but readiness, the readiness of a space that has been used well and will be used well again, that contains within its organized warmth everything needed to begin the next thing whenever the next thing is required. Outside the forge, the bronze walls of the palace Hephaestus had built caught whatever light was moving across Olympus at that hour and held it in the way that a well-made bronze surface holds light, evenly, completely, without favoring any particular angle, the whole surface receiving the whole of what was offered to it and returning it in kind. The palace stood on the mountain as it had always stood, built by no other hand, its walls a record of the attention that had been brought to their making, the structure exactly as large as it needed to be, and no larger, everything it required already inside it, nothing extraneous admitted, the home shaped entirely and precisely by the hands that lived within it. The Hephaestion stands on its low hill above the Athenian agora in the early morning, before the city has fully woken. Its columns are Doric, cut from Pentelic marble, and in the first light of the day they hold a color that is not quite white and not quite gold, something between the two that only marble produces, only at that hour, only when the air is still. The structure has stood on that hill for 2,500 years. It stands there still. Below it, where the ground slopes toward the agora, the metalworking quarter of Athens once occupied the streets in a dense community of workshops and forges, and the particular kind of industry that runs on heat. Bronze smiths worked in those streets. Potters fired their kilns within sight of the temple's colonnade. The proximity was not accidental. The god whose house stood on the hill above them was the same God whose fire burned in their furnaces, whose skill they invoked when the metal refused to behave, whose presence they felt in the weight of the tongue and the resistance of the alloy. His temple was built where it was built because the people most devoted to him lived and worked on the ground below it. There is something particular about a temple that looks down on the labor it sanctifies. The Hephaestians' position on the Kolonos Agoraios was a statement in stone about where this god's power lived, not in the remote, cloud-wrapped heights of divine abstraction, but close to the forge, close to the smoke, close to the street where the work was done. The building itself, a Doric peritoral structure, meaning a rectangular temple completely encircled by a row of columns, was constructed between approximately 460 and 415 BCE from the same Pentelic marble that the Athenians were using for the Parthenon during those same decades. Both buildings belong to that concentrated Athenian building program of the 5th century, when the city was reshaping itself in stone after the Persian destruction of the older temples. But the Parthenon stood on the high Acropolis, visible for miles in every direction, dedicated to the goddess of wisdom and civic order. The Hephaestians stood lower, closer to the working city, dedicated to the god who made things. The distinction in elevation was a distinction in kind, and the people of Athens understood it well enough to have placed each building exactly where they did. The god to whom the Hephaestion was dedicated had a cult that was older than the building, older than the city in its classical form, older probably than most of the stories about him that the Athenians would have known. His name, Hephaestus, does not derive cleanly from any Greek root, and scholars have long speculated that it may be pre-Greek in origin, a name that was already present in the Aegean world before the Greek-speaking populations arrived and began absorbing the divine traditions they found there. Whether or not that etymology holds, the presence of fireworking as a human activity far predates the myths that were told to explain it, and the god who governed that activity carried the weight of something very old in his name, something that had been accumulated over more time than any single story could contain. The Athenians who brought offerings to the Hephaestion in the 5th century BCE were continuing a religious relationship with fire and craft that their ancestors had maintained for generations before the temple was built, before the classical stories were fixed, before Homer's epics were written down. The festivals held in Hephaestion's honor were among the more unusual on the Athenian calendar, and the most elaborate were not in Athens itself, but on Lemnos, the island in the northern Aegean that ancient sources consistently identify as the place where Hephaestus landed after his fall from the divine mountain. The Hephaestia festival on Lemnos involved torch races of the kind that several Greek festivals employed, competitive runs in which participants carried fire from one point to another, the flame itself being the object of the contest rather than the runner's speed alone. A runner who arrived first, but whose torch had gone out lost. The fire had to arrive. In that small ceremonial constraint, something about the god's nature was already present. The importance of the flame held throughout the effort, the skill required not just to move fast, but to protect what you were carrying while you moved. The torch races on Lemnos were religious competitions, but they were also, in their structure, a small enacted meditation on what Hephaestians embodied, the discipline of keeping fire alive across the distance it needed to travel. The purification ritual associated with Lemnos was stranger and older in feel. At certain intervals, all the fires on the island were extinguished. Every hearth went cold. Every forge was unlit. The workshops fell silent in a particular way that only happens when there is no fire burning anywhere nearby, a silence that has a texture to it, the absence of something that had been present continuously for so long that its absence felt like a change in the quality of the air itself. The island remained without fire for 9 days. Ancient sources describe this period as a purification, a ritual clearing that preceded renewal, and the specific number 9 carries weight in ancient Greek religious practice as a number associated with completion and transition. On the 10th day, a ship arrived. It had sailed from Delos, the small Cycladic island that was the sanctuary of Apollo and one of the holiest sites in the Aegean world, and it carried a sacred flame. That flame was brought ashore and distributed. From a single source, fire was passed from vessel to vessel, from hearth to hearth, from forge to forge, until the entire island was lit again from the same origin. Every fire on Lemnos, when it burned again, burned with fire that had come from the same place, carried across the same water, on the same ship. What that ritual preserved, whatever its origins, was a relationship between fire and community that the story of Hephaestus expressed in mythological terms. Fire is not simply a tool in these traditions. It is a presence, something that must be maintained, something whose extinction and relative beginning marks a boundary between states. The 9 days of cold and dark on Lemnos functioned as a kind of death, not a total or permanent one, but a ritual death, a clearing away, followed by a reanimation that was also a unification, every fire in the community descending from the same ancestor flame, the same sacred source. In the same way that the myths described Hephaestus as the source of divine fire on Olympus, the ritual on Lemnos cast the sacred flame from Delos in the same structural role, the origin from which everything else lit. The island's volcanic character reinforced all of this. Lemnos had ancient associations with subterranean fire, with the kind of natural phenomenon that ancient peoples interpreted as evidence of divine activity underground, and those associations made it the natural earthly home for a god whose element was the forge. On the Greek mainland and in the cities of Ionia, Hephaestus appeared in ritual and in art with a frequency that suggests a widely distributed cult rather than a merely literary presence. The scenes painted on Athenian pottery in the archaic and early classical periods returned to him repeatedly, and one mythological episode above all others became a touchstone for the ceramic workshops, the return of Hephaestus to Olympus. The story, told in various forms across ancient sources, holds that Hephaestus had once bound Hera to a golden throne from which she could not free herself, a device of his own making, and a response to whatever grievance the tradition attributed to him against his mother. The gods of Olympus were unable to release her, and the smith refused to return to the divine mountain to do it himself. In most versions of the story, it was Dionysus, the god of wine, theater, and altered states, who resolved the impasse by getting Hephaestus drunk enough to return willingly, leading him back up to Olympus in a procession that combined the comic and the ceremonial in proportions the Athenian potters apparently found irresistible. The image appears on dozens of surviving vessels from approximately 580 BCE onward, Hephaestus mounted on a mule, surrounded by satyrs, conducted back toward the divine mountain by the god of wine. The scene carrying a mixture of triumphant return and undignified transit that the archaic ceramic tradition held in balance with remarkable skill. The Francois Face, an Attic black figure crater made around 570 BCE and now preserved in the National Archaeological Museum in Florence, carries Hephaestus within its complex painted program, the figures arranged in the formal procession style of archaic Athenian ceramics, deliberate, symmetrical, each figure in its specific place within a scene that moves across the vessel's surface with the deliberate pace of a religious frieze. The Francois vase is one of the most extensively labeled ancient Greek pots in existence, its figures identified by name in painted inscriptions, which means that scholars can say with certainty which figure is which, and how the painter understood the mythological scene being depicted. The pot was made by Ergotimos and painted by Claudius, and their collaboration produced something that reads less like decoration and more like a compendium, a gathering of the major mythological moments of the tradition, arranged around the vessel's body with the same patient comprehensiveness a librarian might bring to organizing a collection. Hephaestus's presence within it is evidence not only that he was a god of wide and lasting importance, but that the ceramic workshops of Athens were doing something with mythological imagery that went beyond mere illustration. They were participating in the transmission of the tradition, making it visible, keeping it moving from one generation of viewers to the next. The god also appears in Hesiod's works and days, in a role quite different from his forge work on Olympus. In that poem, composed in the late 8th or early 7th century BCE, Hesiod describes the creation of Pandora, the first woman in the Hesiodic account of human origins, and places Hephaestus at the beginning of that making. At Zeus's command, Hephaestus took earth and water and shaped from them the physical form of Pandora, fashioning her with the craftsmanship he brought to all his works, giving her the outward form of a goddess, while the other Olympians contributed their own gifts. Athena taught her weaving. Aphrodite gave her grace. Hermes gave her speech and a particular kind of cunning. But Hephaestus was the one who began it, who worked the earth and the water into the first human female form, who brought his particular skill to the making of something that was neither a weapon nor a mechanism, but a person, or something that would function as one. The role is consistent with what the tradition held about him in other contexts. He was the craftsman who initiated, who transformed raw material into shaped form, who began the thing that others would complete. In the making of Pandora, as in the making of Achilles' armor, or the bronze giant who walked the shores of Crete, Hephaestus was the one who gave the formless something its first definition. That role in the Pandora story connects his craft to something broader than metallurgy, to the making of things that live, or that behave as though they live, or that change the conditions of life for everyone who comes after them. The jar that Pandora carried, in the tradition Hesiod preserves, contained what it contained, and released what it released, and the conditions of human civilization were transformed by what emerged from it. Hephaestus did not fill the jar. He was not responsible for its contents, but he made the vessel through which those contents would eventually travel, which is a different kind of responsibility, the maker's responsibility, the craftsman's implication in whatever his making makes possible. In the tradition, he seems to have held that implication without particular protest, as he held most things with the steady, practical attention of someone whose work was always the next immediate thing to be done, rather than the distant consequence of what had already been completed. His cult moved westward, as the Greeks moved westward. The colonial expansion of Greek settlement across the Mediterranean, which intensified from the 8th century BCE onward and continued through the following centuries, carried the gods of the tradition into landscapes that had their own local presences, their own volcanic fires, their own traditions of metalworking and craft. In Sicily, where Greek colonists established major settlements from the 8th century onward, the volcanic activity of Mount Etna dominated the landscape in a way that demanded mythological explanation. The mountain was enormous, it was visibly alive, in the way that only volcanoes are alive. The slow, continuous production of heat and light from within the earth, the occasional eruptions that transformed the landscape around them, the persistent sense that something was happening underground that had not stopped happening since before anyone now alive had been born. Greek colonists in Sicily had been connecting Etna to Hephaestus since at least the 5th century BCE, and the connection was natural in the same way that the connection between Lemnos and Hephaestus was natural, where fire came from the ground, where the earth itself seemed to be working. Hephaestus was already present in the logic of the tradition. In the Roman period and the post-classical world, the Sicilian identification became dominant. Mount Etna became the primary mythological location of his forge in Latin literary tradition, displacing to some degree the Olympian workshop and the Lemnian associations that had predominated in the Greek sources. Virgil and Ovid and their contemporaries wrote Hephaestus in his Roman form, Vulcan, into the Sicilian volcanic landscape with the confidence of writers working within a tradition that had already made that identification familiar. The Cyclopes worked the bellows in the forge beneath Etna in those accounts. The mountain shuddered with the impacts of the divine smith's hammering. The fire that emerged from the summit was the overflow of the work being done far below, the excess heat of a forge that never stopped. The image was compelling precisely because it located divine industry inside the actual physical world, not on a remote divine mountain, accessible only to immortals, but inside a real geological feature that any traveler in Sicily could see and feel and smell. The myth had become topography. The forge had acquired a specific address. What is interesting about that geographic extension is not merely that it happened, but what it reveals about the way mythological traditions grow and travel. A tradition that began in the Aegean world, rooted in specific islands and specific cult sites, followed the movement of the people who held it into new landscapes and found in those landscapes new confirmation of what it already knew. Lemnos had volcanic fire. Sicily had more of it, larger and more dramatic. The god whose element was fire moved to where the fire was. The tradition was not rigid. It was not a text requiring faithful reproduction in new locations. It was a living presence that could recognize itself in new environments and establish new roots there. The way a plant moved from one soil to another will grow differently in the new ground while remaining the same plant. The forge beneath Etna is not the forge on Olympus, but Hephaestus is in both of them, working, and the fire he tends is the same fire, burning at different depths, beneath different mountains, under a different sky. The artisans of the ancient world who worked with fire and metal carried this tradition into their daily labor in ways that were partly ceremonial and partly simply practical. A smith who invoked Hephaestus before beginning a difficult cast was doing something different from a scholar who read about him in Homer, not less than and not more, but different in kind, grounded in the specific physical relationship between a craftsman and his materials, between a worker and the fire he depended on. The prayers and offerings at forges and kilns were not performances of piety. They were acknowledgments of dependency, recognitions that the craft required something more than skill alone, that there was a dimension of the work that fell outside the craftsman's control, no matter how experienced he was. Metal that should have poured cleanly sometimes didn't. Kilns that had been perfectly stoked produced uneven results. The fire itself had moods, or seemed to, and a tradition that gave that fire a personality. Lame, intelligent, precise, capable of extraordinary things, was also giving craftsmen a way to speak about the part of the work that exceeded their mastery. The Athenian festival calendar included events in honor of Hephaestus during the Chalcaea, a festival whose name derives from the Greek word for bronze, chalkos, and which was associated specifically with the artisan communities of Athens, the smiths and potters, and metalworkers who gave the city many of its tools, its containers, its decorative objects, its weapons. Athena was also honored at the Chalcaea. The two gods worshipped together as patrons of craft, divine intelligence, and divine making, joined in a single festival structure. The pairing is not arbitrary. In the tradition, Athena and Hephaestus were both understood as gods of techne, of skill applied intelligently to material, of the thinking that precedes and accompanies making. Athena governed the weaving and the strategic planning. Hephaestus governed the forge. Together they covered a wide portion of the productive activity that sustained Athenian life, and their joint festival was an acknowledgement that craft at its best required both of them. The Hephaestion on its hill above the agora still stands within walking distance of where those workshops operated, their foundations visible in the archaeological record. The spatial relationship between the temple and the craft district preserved in the city's geography, even after the city itself has been transformed, almost beyond recognition. To walk from the Hephaestion down into the agora and across to the Kerameikos, the ancient ceramic district, is to walk the same general route that the craftsmen of classical Athens would have walked on the day of the Chalcaea, carrying their offerings up to the temple before the day's competition began. The route is short, the hill is not steep, but the proximity of the temple to the work it sanctified is evident in that short walk, in the way the Doric columns of the Hephaestion remain visible from the street level below, even after 2,500 years of change to the ground around them. There is a quality of persistence in that visibility that seems appropriate to the god the building honors. Hephaestion, in the tradition, was the one who kept working. Thrown from the mountain, he landed on an island and built a forge. Rejected or displaced or injured, he returned to the work. The Olympians laughed at his limping gait in the feasting hall, and he continued his careful circuit of the table with the wine. His wife was unfaithful, and he addressed the situation with the only tools he had, which were the tools of his craft. He made things. He kept making things. The forge was always lit, the bellows always working, the metal always in some stage of becoming what it would eventually be. The tradition does not present this as resignation or as a narrowing of ambition. It presents it as the full expression of a specific kind of intelligence, one that manifested entirely in the act of making and had no need of any other arena to prove itself. When the Roman writers took the god they called Vulcan and placed his forge beneath Etna, they were extending a tradition that had always understood him as belonging to places of fire and work rather than places of ceremony and order. The divine mountain of the Olympians in the Greek tradition was a place of feasting and deliberation and occasional spectacle. Hephaestus was there. In the tradition, he was one of the 12. He had his seat in the council. He had his bronze palace that he had built himself. But his forge was what defined him, and the forge was never quite comfortable in the serene heights where the other gods banqueted. It was hot and bright and productive of noise and smoke and the particular kind of focused disorder that attends any place where serious making is underway. It belonged in some sense to a lower altitude, closer to the human world of labor, closer to the volcanic earth, closer to the fire that burns without ceremony in a craftsman's shed at the edge of a working city. The island of Lemnos understood this. The artisans of Athens understood it. The Greek colonists who looked up at Etna and felt the ground warm beneath their feet understood it. And the Roman poets who set his forge inside the mountain, surrounded by the Cyclopes and the continuous percussion of immortal metalwork, were understanding it in their own way, placing the great divine craftsman not in the sky but in the earth, not above the human world but beneath it, working at the source of the fire that human beings had always drawn upward to warm themselves and shape their tools and fire their kilns and light their streets. The light that falls on the Hephaestion in the early morning is still falling on it now, in the sense that the same sun crosses the same sky above the same columns that were placed there by Athenian builders in the 5th century BCE. The metalworking district below the hill is gone, replaced by centuries of other occupation, other building, other kinds of industry, and then their absence. But the temple itself has endured in a condition of preservation, unusual even among surviving ancient Greek structures, its columns intact, its basic architecture readable, its position on the hill above the agora unchanged. It has been a Christian church. It has been a burial ground. It has been a monument in a modern archaeological park where people from every part of the world come to look at what the ancient Athenians built and try to feel across the distance of time what it meant to have built it. The god it honors has continued to be told about, written about, painted, and depicted in every medium available to the people who have encountered the tradition since it was first recorded. The stories that were told about Hephaestus traveled with the same persistence that the temple's stone has shown. They traveled through the library at Alexandria, where Hellenistic scholars annotated the Homeric texts and noted the contradictions in his parentage, and attempted to reconcile the differing accounts without resolution. They traveled through the Roman tradition, acquiring a Latin name and a Sicilian volcano and a new set of literary associations, while retaining the essential character, the limping gait, the forge, the extraordinary making, the particular intelligence that expressed itself entirely in craft. They traveled through the medieval period in the Latin texts that preserved fragments of the classical tradition, and through the Renaissance, when those texts were recovered and read with new attention by scholars who found in them the same patient interest that the Alexandrian annotators had brought to the same pages centuries before. They are still traveling. The volcano on the Sicilian coast holds its slow glow above the dark water. It has been doing this for longer than the stories about Hephaestus have existed. The fire inside it is geological, the product of the same planetary processes that have been operating since the Earth was formed, and with processes that have nothing to do with divine smithcraft or mythological narrative or the traditions any human civilization has built around the presence of fire in its life. And yet the stories that grew up around that mountain and around the fire god who was eventually placed inside it are in their own way as persistent as the geological fact. They have continued to be told. The tradition that carried Hephaestus from the forge on Olympus to the island of Lemnos, to the bronze workshops of Athens, to the slopes of Etna, has continued to move, finding new minds willing to hold it, new voices willing to speak it, new listeners in dark rooms receiving it with the patient attention that old stories deserve. The columns of the Hephaestion, in the morning before the city is fully awake, hold their particular color between white and gold. The metalworking quarter below them is gone, but the slope of the hill is the same slope, and the angle of the early light is the same angle. And somewhere in the specific quality of that stillness, the marble catching the first warmth of the day, the city beginning to move below, the ancient structure standing in its quiet regularity above all of it, something of what the tradition preserved about this god is still present. not as belief necessarily, or as ceremony, or as the particular relationship between a craftsman and the divine fire he depended on, but as a shape in the air,